Hi, I'm Megan. Welcome to today's live reading of A Garland at Bitterbark Creek by Tammy Mannersley, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Joined me prologue 20 years ago. Her petite form sank slowly, lifelessly, into the murky water of the Garland Dam. The sudden stillness made everything almost peaceful again. There was no more splashing, no more screaming, and the children restraining Jack held their breath as they watched. The chirping of the birds returned, and in the distance he could hear the soft beat of music wafting across the hillside from its parents' annual picnic. Jack's heartbeat shook his whole body, thumping loudly, deafeningly in his ears. His stomach throbbed from his sister's painful punch and the nausea bubbling within. Bruises circled his scrawny arms from where his captor's small, nimble fingers had locked on, yanking him so viciously away from the edge. But their hold had loosened considerably as they watched someone they'd once called friend slip closer to the very bottom of the large dam. Wasn't it just the other day they were rolling down the grassy hills together with the farm dogs? They had been laughing so hard, breathless, not a care in the world. But the car accident had changed that, and his mother's opinion of the Wendell family even more still. It was their fault his father had been injured. They were not to be trusted. That's what Jack's mother had said, yet Jack's heart hurt more now than it had in his anger. He hated that he'd shared his sister's rage, had hated that in his blind obedience he had made a decision he wouldn't forever regret. He knew it hadn't been the girl's fault, it hadn't been her family's. Her loss had been greater. But Jack loved his father, an adoration his sister shared, and his family had desperately needed someone to blame. It wasn't right, but it was all he could do not to lose himself. The accident had been terrifying, but his father had eventually made it home. It was this little girl turned listless sea creature whose father would never return. An eternity passed as all five children peered over the edge of the jetty into the depths below, watching the jet black swirl of hair sink lower. Help! It was a quiet squeak of a sound, but it drew all attention to the youngest of the group. His sister's cold, violently blue eyes shot to Ella. The little girl flinched and released Jack. Help! Ella said a little louder. Jack's final two captors tightened their hold for an instant before releasing him. They both spun to face the traitor as she backed away, her wide eyes flicking between them like a lamb hunted by wolves. Help! Ella's high-pitched voice sounded strangled as she began to cry. Help! She screamed, stumbling, her tiny feet tripping over themselves. Then she turned and ran along the jetty towards the shore. Help, Mummy, help! His sister nodded for the other two children to follow and then threw the whip-like stick she'd been clutching into the dam. She watched it bob above the sinking child, then her glacial gaze shifted to Jack. If you truly are my brother, you'll leave her and come with us. Jack held her stare. She sounded so much like their mother, full of hatred. Was this the loving family he had betrayed his truest friend to protect? His love for that little girl disappearing into the depths had always been greater than anything he'd ever felt for his sister. How dare he let himself believe otherwise? His sister hurried after the others. He didn't wait to see if she'd turn to check if he was following. He just dove into the water and swam towards the whirl of ebony that marked the presence of that drowned mermaid, the sweet friend he'd known as Sophie. Chapter 1. Wide grassy pastures and lush thickets of bushland whizzed past Sophie Wendell's window. The natural beauty, still crisp and golden and a little dry from the winter drought, took on a dreamlike quality as Sophie viewed it from the shelter of her mother's car. It was a familiar landscape, one that called to her in sleep. Vivid memories haunted her, reminding her of a life that had once seemed perfect before destiny had intervened. Dawn had broken over an hour ago, gleaming above the hills behind them, and intense rays of full daylight had burst over the road. Coming alive with the glow of morning, the parrots, kookaburras, and lorikeets sang a greeting to the light, excitedly heralding the birth of another blessed day. Even her mother hummed pleasantly to the lively country tune playing on the local radio station as it drifted from the small speakers to fill the atmosphere of the car. It was only Sophie who felt the foreboding, who developed a general malaise the closer their journey got to its end. Not long now, darling. Angelica nodded to the navigation device stuck to the windshield. The little red marker indicating their destination had appeared at the top of the screen. Bitterbark Creek, her aunt and uncle's farmstay, was positioned on 500 acres of heavily treed land. It sat on the outskirts of Moorhen Vale, a traditional country town just northeast of Warwick, and had once been the place Sophie had called home. Although their brief return was in celebration of their cousin Patrick's upcoming wedding, Sophie feared this immersion into a past life she'd wished to keep buried. During the 20 years she'd spent living in West End, the eclectic, trendy heart of Brisbane, she had never once considered making the trip back to the place that had stolen her memories and cursed her with heartache. Her stomach churned as the image of a boy flashed to the forefront of her mind. Jackson Garland, the grin he'd given her when he'd been caught sneaking strands of hay into her braids, his endearing laughter when she'd slapped his hands away. Though she tried to deny it, his name was still seared into her soul. It had made his betrayal hurt even more. I'm trying to remember, Sophia. Her mum's voice sounded distant, thoughtful. When was the last time you saw your Uncle Nicholas? You mean besides on Skype? She picked anxiously at her fingernails. In person, I can't seem to place it. Sophie gulped back a swirl of nausea. They had seen Aunt Robin, Pat, and Laura many times over the years. Her cousin Laura had even stayed with Sophie in Brisbane for a month while she completed the technical exams for her photography degree. As for her Uncle Nick, it wasn't a surprise that her mother couldn't remember their last time together. It said a person blocks painful memories to protect themselves. The hospital. Sophie distracted herself with the charming scenery outside her window. He stayed with me until you arrived. He had held her hand in the ambulance while one paramedic maintained her vitals and the other drove speedily toward to Warwick Hospital. At the time, they told him he was a hero, that she was lucky he'd known how to resuscitate her. But he hadn't been listening to them. He had just kept telling her over and over again that it was all going to be all right. Angelica swallowed loudly. Sorry, darling, I didn't realize. The subject was still too painful for them both. No one wanted to reminisce about the time their 10-year-old daughter attempted suicide. Although Sophie's memories of the actual events were lost, she knew for certain that suicide hadn't been the case. It had taken years of therapy and arguing to finally convince her mother to discount the rumors that spread through town. No matter what Garland family and their ilk had, no matter what the Garland family and their ilk had suggested, the sudden loss of Sophie's father hadn't broken her young brain. Yet the stigma still haunted them. Only a few things remained certain. Sophie had nearly drowned in the Garland Dam that day. Several children had seen her jump in and not resurface. But why she'd gone into the water alone in the first place was locked in some cave of distant memory. Although she longed to know the truth, she feared the betrayals it might hold. Now she was hurtling right into the mouth of trouble, and the thought of what her mind may unleash was more terrifying than the reception she expected from the townsfolk. Beyond Sophie's window, a herd of Frisian cattle huddled in a paddock, their black and white spots juxtaposed against the dry, honeydew-colored grass. It was so serene that for an instant she warmed with fondness for the familiar wilderness. She and Jack had chased each other through similar fields, picking dandelions and playing tag, always smiling and laughing, never wanting to be apart. A vision of Jack's sullen face as Sophie and her mother left the last day filled her mind's eye. She knew he didn't want her to leave, but he and his family had given hers no other choice. He had picked their side. He had kept his distance from her. He hadn't denied their lies. His choices had broken something between them, a deep connection they had built with trust and love. She could see he longed to have it back, but by that point it was much too late. Sophie shook away the memory of Jack's haunted expression and tried to focus on the present. Perhaps she could enjoy this break in the country for what it was and reconnect with her beloved extended family. Her infamy must have transferred to a new victim after 2 decades. Why would the tiny town dwell on such a prehistoric drama, anyway? She pinched the bridge of her nose. Who was she kidding? Small towns thrived on sordid history and gossip. The community probably knew she would be in town for Pat's wedding, and the Garlands wouldn't hesitate to fill them in on all the juicy details. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut. It would be a real test of character to remain polite amid the prying, but she wasn't about to give anyone the pleasure of seeing her squirm. Sophie felt the car slow and heard the click of the indicator. Looks like we have a welcoming party. Sophie's mother steered their navy sedan through the grand entrance of the Bitterbark Creek farmstay. Bronze horse heads crowned each parallel brick pillar as the car's tires crunched on the dusty gravel driveway. Excited yips rose over the noise to greet them. Horace and Banjo, two young Kelpie heeler crosses, were the second incarnation of the farm dog she'd known as a child. They raced along the vehicle, jumping, trying to sneak a peek through the tinted windows. Her mother laughed. You would think they'd never had visitors before. A smile tugged at Sophie's lips, the first since starting the trip. She glanced up at the long, sprawling ranch-style homestead, made of cream-colored timber and sporting a corrugated iron roof, the same shade as the frosty green grassland. They're not the only ones, she said, catching sight of her family waiting at the top of the short wooden staircase leading to the wraparound veranda. She waved as her mother parked the car and saw her Uncle Nick, a giant, burly man, hasten down the steps towards the vehicles. His dark brown eyes were friendly, so like her own and her mother's, and his toothy grin sparkled with the gray of his neatly trimmed beard. Just like her mother, he'd let his jet black hair ashen naturally, but their Italian genes shone through in their straight, regal noses, their raven-haired children in the Mediterranean tan of both families. He had the door open before Sophie finished removing her seatbelt. Pulling her from the car, he scooped her up into his muscular arms, leaving her boot-clad feet dangling in the chilly morning air. She gasped for breath as his tight embrace caused her bones in her spine to crack loudly. Sophia, his gravelly voice sounded choked. It's been too long, Chooky. 20 years, too long. Sophie felt winded at his use of the special nickname and struggled to keep her eyes from welling up. Geez, she had missed him dearly. She cuddled him tighter before he lowered her to the ground. It's so good again. It's so good to see you again, Chook. He left one hand securely on her shoulder as his eyes moistened. We are so happy you could make it for the wedding. It's good to see you too, Uncle Nick. Sophie clasped his hand in hers before turning to embrace the short, shapely woman who had appeared beside them. Her pixie face and blonde, almost silver hair gave her a doll-like appearance. Aunt Robin. Sophie, sweetheart, you're so beautiful. Robin regarded Sophie's white blouse and dusky bohemian skirt. Too cosmopolitan for our little town. And look, you've dyed your hair. Sophie tunneled her fingers through her long golden mane. It was time for a change, I guess. It's been like that for over a year now, ever since things ended with Mason, Angelica piped up. She was at the back of the car, greeting Pat, Laura, and the two farm dogs. Thanks for the overshare, Mum. Sophie patted Boris, then Banjo, before approaching her cousins. I didn't much like that boy, Uncle Nick sniffed, too focused on the social medias from what Laura told us. Dad, Laura scolded, throw me under the bus as the town gossip, why don't you? Uncle Nick ignored his daughter's protest and greeted his sister with a hug. Angie, you're so thin. Look at these twiglet arms. Doesn't that husband of yours feed you? Where is he, anyway? As Sophie pulled Laura in for a hug, she heard her mother's laugh. Stuart had a last-minute invite to speak at an architecture conference in Adelaide, but he sends his apologies. I did call earlier in the week to let you know. Remember, Nikki? Robin asked, that phone call on Monday? I told you Sophie's stepfather was called away and wouldn't be coming. There was a second of silence as Uncle Nick gave her a blank look, and then she laughed. Sorry, Angie. The past couple of weeks have been a blur. I take it you missed me then? Sophie coughed, freeing herself from Laura's painfully tight embrace. You're all Laura's been talking about for the last year. There was a teasing glint in Pat's deep brown eyes. You and her time in the city. I'm surprised she hasn't moved out there yet, Sophie winked at Laura. Laura's cropped black hair, delicate features, and petite tomboyish physique made her seem younger than her 28 years. Give me time. I'm still saving. Pat stretched his arms wide. Come here, he told Sophie, pulling her against his rangy body for a brief squeeze. We've all missed you, Soph. It's good to have you home. Home. The word bit into Sophie's heart like a knife. Thanks, Pat, she sighed shakily. So, when do I get to meet the bride-to-be? Be careful what you wish for, he warned. Marilyn's at her mom's today, but tonight is the hens. It's going to be wild. Laura slipped her arm through Sophie's, yanking her closer. We've even got a stripper.